Chapter 18, we are going to be looking at hopefully the whole chapter today. We did cover a tiny bit of it, not a tiny bit of it, almost half of it last week. So John 18, we talked about last week the scene in the garden and how the soldiers came to arrest Jesus. They were taken aback when Jesus stepped forward, I guess you could say. Jesus stepped forward and they fell back and they stooped to the ground and they basically I think they worshipped, when they heard the name Jehovah. And so that's one thing that John includes that is pretty important, I think. It kind of sets the tone for who Jesus was. Remember, John is trying from his perspective to illustrate that Jesus is the Son of God. He's not the fulfillment, is not just the fulfillment of prophecy like Matthew portrays, Luke portrays, the Son of Man, the humanity part of Jesus. John, if you had to boil it down, would be describing the deity of Jesus, and so the awestruckness of Jesus. And so people that were, that beheld him, they beheld that he was the Christ, that he was the Son of God, God in the flesh, and that's the way he starts his book off, and that's the way that it's continuing. And so in chapter 18, it says a little recap from last week. We talked about the garden scene. We talked about how in verse 10, just as soon as Peter saw the writing on the wall that things were going to, start to move along here, that Jesus was going to be arrested, and Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant's ear and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And so what we see, I kind of painted the picture in my mind that it was like you have the soldiers on one end, you have Jesus and his disciples on the other end, and they're confronted now, facing each other. Jesus steps forward to take one literally for the team, says, "Let these ones go." But Peter next to him says, "This isn't going to happen." Because everything leading up to that moment in Peter's mind was, this isn't going to happen. Who remembers when Jesus told him specifically, "I'm going to the cross, in so many words, I'm going to be betrayed and I'm going to die, but I'm going to be resurrected in 3 days." What did Peter pull him to? Do you remember Peter pulled him to the side and had a private conversation with Jesus and said, that's not going to happen to you. That's not how this is going to end. You're going to be the great teacher. We're going to follow you for the rest of our lives, and you're going to teach us these things. Your life's not going to end this way. Well, what did Jesus have to say about that? "Get behind me, Satan." Right? He told him that you're not mindful of the things of God. You're not really thinking about God's plan. You're just thinking about in the moment that you don't want to lose your leader and that these things couldn't possibly happen to you. I think that's what he was thinking about. And so we see here that Peter, in his mind, was all geared up for this to not happen. And I think that's why he packed a sword that night. The night was already different. The night had a different feel to it. Jesus is giving more of a final, what's the word? A final message to his disciples. Peter, a summation of the last 3.5 years. These things were already different. And so Peter, I think, said, okay, if this is still going to happen, as Jesus is saying it's going to happen, it's not going to happen on my watch. And so when he senses that the soldiers now have stood back up and they're about ready to arrest Jesus, that's when he finally, in his last-ditch effort, takes that sword and cuts off the servant's ear, saying, this isn't going to happen. Have we ever done that? And, we see a certain situation heading a certain way, and we're like, okay, this is it. If this is not going to happen, this is the last thing, this is the last chance that I have to possibly stop it. Mm-hmm. Well, this was Peter's last chance before he could stop it.
Well, and just thinking about it, assuming Peter was right-handed, the servant wasn't standing prepared. He wasn't. Doesn't seem like he would be facing Peter or standing in a position to where he would be any threat to Peter either. You think about it, right-hand swing, that goes after the left ear. Two people facing each other, not the right.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Or if the servant was standing on the right side facing, and Peter was on the right side. Yeah. He would have been on the left side of Jesus if they're facing him.
Yeah.
If he was right-handed.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like going after a actual threat, just one that he was perceiving.
Yeah, and honestly, he wanted to start a fight.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't do that kind of thing, you know, it's like it's like the Boston Massacre, you know, who shot first, you know, the Americans were throwing stones and stuff, and you don't really know who shot first, you know. But they were both facing each other, an angry mob and an angry soldiers, getting tired of getting picked on, you know. How did that altercation start? Well, someone had to start it. Someone shot first, as it were. And then the altercation went on into history. Well, you have Peter wanting to start this whole fight. Well, Jesus specifically says, we'll read today that Jesus specifically says that if my kingdom were of now, right now, my servants would fight, and I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But Peter had to get in line with that line of thinking. Instead of everything that is going to happen now, everything's going to be delayed. He heard the sermons, he heard the parables, he'd heard those things, but they didn't sink in. I think we talked last week about how this moment didn't really sink in for the apostles. It would, though, you know, obviously read the epistles that they wrote. It sunk in, something fierce.
Yeah.
But at this moment, and we can't blame them, but at this moment, it didn't sink in. So we're going to see here.
You think Peter was
Yep.
remembering his own words? Lord, I'll die for you. And the others said, yeah, we'll die.
Probably.
Maybe trying to force it now, because this is the time, this is the moment, and so.
You mean at the moment, did they remember that?
I'm wondering, well, he may not have remembered his words, or he may have, because it was such a spontaneous thing.
Yeah.
I would imagine that now they've come, I mean, these guys are armed, so he's got a sword, they're armed.
Yeah.
If you're gonna draw a weapon, this will be the time to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because remember earlier, he said, I will die for you, you know.
Mhm.
You know, so now this is the moment. So I'm wondering, I don't know if you remember the exact words, but just got caught up in that he was at that time willing to die.
And something else that's popped in my mind was, you know, when they went down to, well, remember they were up in the northern part. They were in the Sea of Galilee, right? And the disciples, Jesus was trying to decide if he wanted to go down to Jerusalem, and the disciples said, "Look, you know, he wants to go to Jerusalem. Let's go with him, that we might die with him." So I think that they were already on edge, knowing that the opposition was there, knowing that the Jews wanted to arrest Jesus, knowing the Jews wanted to put him to death. Jesus was talking about that. So I think for Peter to have a sword is completely within his thinking, you know, to arm himself, you know, in case, you know, it's like if you go into a dangerous neighborhood, you better have some sort of weapon in your glove box or something, you know, or if not on your body. I mean, you need to protect yourself, and so I think that's what Peter was thinking when he was armed. And we don't know if the other disciples were armed or not, but it was Peter specifically that said, "This isn't going to happen to you," and you know, like you said, I'll die before denying you. I'll die before this happens. So I think it completely makes sense to me that Peter had his sword on, and also just his personality that he cut off the right ear of the serpent. So Jesus said to Peter, verse 11, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" We talked last week. Jesus had already arrived at that decision. The third time he came back and said, "It's happening now." And another scripture actually says that while he was still speaking to the disciples that third time, Judas Iscariot comes up. While he was speaking, Judas comes up to him. And so everything that happened after he came back that third time happened just like that. And so the disciples who had been sleeping, well, they woke up. Oh boy, they were awake now. You see somebody coming to arrest you with swords and clubs and in the middle of the night with torches, you perk up. And Jesus, do you think he got a break? You know, we talk about the agony on the cross, having nails driven into your hands and feet, left there to suffocate. But the agony, he had stayed up that whole night too. He was up that entire day. He was up that entire night. How do I know that? Well, we'll read that today. But then he was up for the next, 6 hours of the next day as well. I think he died around 3. Actually, it was more than 6 hours. So, I think he was put on the cross. We'll have to look at that. I'm not sure. He was on the cross for a long time too. And so, at the agony of sleep deprivation and everything else he went through. Verse 12 says, "Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. So their temporal, falling back and standing in awe of the name Jehovah, observing Jesus' countenance, his voice, his calmness, his demeanor, that had put them into a worshipful state. They shook that off. Now they got a job to do. They remembered that their job is to arrest Jesus, and that's exactly what they did. They bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. This is interesting, because John goes into verse 14 here, and he reminds us of what he already wrote. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Why is that important? Why did John choose to include that particular story twice? This is the second time. He included it once. Now he's going back and referencing it. Well, I think that kind of deserves our attention. Back in John 11. See, the Jews didn't know what to do with Jesus. And they really didn't know what to do with him after he raised Lazarus from the dead. They was like, okay, that's it. Final straw. What do we do with this man? Everybody's going after him. The entire world, isn't that what they say? The entire world's going after him. That's what it felt like after you do a miracle like that. What do we do? Well, first you hold a council to talk about these things. And that, they talked about on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. They said that, you got your 3 lifelines. You got your phone a friend, right? Then you got your 50-50, right? What's that third one?
Ask the audience.
Did you know that Ask the Audience is 91% accurate? And Phone a Friend, the expert, is 50-50? See, there's wisdom in a crowd. There's wisdom when you ask a bunch of people and they come to a consensus. And so is it any wonder why they got together and said, let's talk about these things, all right? And that's what they did in Acts as well. But in verse 45, chapter 11, it says, Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen the things Jesus did believed in him. There's even more people who are believing in him. But some of them went their way to the Pharisees and told the things that Jesus did. Now we're just going to rat on. Some people believed and they kept that as a personal faith. Some people said, I'm just going to go tell the authorities. I'm just going to go rat on them. Maybe I want to look good to the Pharisees. I don't know what their motivation was. But they went in and they ratted on to the Pharisees. Like I said, the Pharisees needed that, extra prodding anyway. Verse 47, it says, Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, What shall we do? For this man works many signs. What are we going to do about this guy? He's working many signs. He's raising people from the dead. He's only doing good. Did you notice that? Even they had to admit that he only does good things. Yeah, it was against what they wanted him to do. He's taking away prestige and power and all that. But he wasn't doing bad things. He wasn't, just going around and cursing a town and all the inhabitants die if they didn't accept the kingdom. No. He said the disciples, when he sent them into the towns, says, shake off the dust off of your feet, leave everything that you brought, leave it there, and move on to the next town. Don't put a curse on them. Don't put any kind of bad blessing on them or whatever. Just move on to the next one. It's not militant. There's no revenge. There's nothing like that. And so Jesus was only going around doing good things. Well, when it came to the chief priests and the Pharisees, when they gathered this council, they could only say that he was doing good things. They said he works many signs. And so their reasoning in verse 48 says, if we let him alone like this, if we just don't do anything, everyone will eventually believe in him. You believe that? Everybody would eventually believe in Jesus? I think with enough time and less opposition from the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees, and all the other people, if they weren't constantly pushing against him, I think people would have believed in him. I think they eventually would have. Look at the triumphal entry when they cut palm trees down, the branches, and they spread their clothes out, and he went in. I think eventually those things would have happened. But that's not what happened. See, Jesus still would have had to have died. He just would have done it because the Romans would have gotten involved. And that's their next point here. He says, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we don't do anything, everyone will eventually believe in him, and the Romans will come in and take away both our place and nation. That's what they were afraid of. And the question is, why were they so afraid of that? Why were they so afraid that the Romans would step in? Isn't this what they've been praying for? Isn't this what they wanted? Didn't they want a champion to come in? Weren't they praying for the Messiah? It's like us praying for Jesus to come back and then us seeing the signs of that happening and saying, wait a minute, I don't want this. Do we want it or don't we want it? It's not going to be pleasant, we're going to see officials get elected in our country and in other countries that we may not want to get elected. It just means that the end is coming soon. That's all that tells me, is that the end is coming soon. When we have leaders that are going to lead us down the path of a place where we wouldn't want to go. Well, here's Jesus who shows up, has all the credentials that they were looking for, does all the signs and way more than they were looking for, has the demeanor, has the right attitude, is only doing good things, and yet they don't want it because their sin is in the way, because their own interpretation of the law is in the way. And so they totally missed the boat. And so what we see is that they shouldn't be worried about Rome coming in. They should be worried, and not worried, but they should be focused on who Jesus is and saying, this is the Messiah, this is our time, the kingdom is now. And wasn't Jesus preaching that? Wasn't his whole message about the kingdom? If they believed him, they could have brought him in, and the kingdom could have been at that time, but it wasn't. And the Romans, yes, the Romans would have come in, but they wouldn't have been worried about it. They wouldn't be worried about losing their autonomy, as it were. They didn't really have, they were still under Roman rule. But at least the Romans let them have the temple. They at least let them have the Sanhedrin. They at least let them have synagogues. They at least let them worship and observe the Sabbath and all these other things. Yes, they had to pay taxes to Rome. Yes, they were subjects of Rome. But Rome didn't really get in and micromanage them. They didn't do that like the Babylonians did when they carted them off and the Babylonians destroyed the temple. And so they still let them do pretty much what they wanted to do. Rome was smart like that, because if you start breaking apart people and redistributing them, they realized that didn't work. And so what we see is that Jesus represented that threat. He shouldn't have been a threat, but to them he represented that threat. So what do we do about it? And I love this. This is not generally, everyone has meetings at work or whatever, you generally don't stand up if you have something to say and start the conversation off like Caiaphas did, okay? This is exactly what he does. If I did this, I probably wouldn't have a job. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. Can you imagine that?
That statement wasn't true. It's a generalized,
Yeah.
you know nothing.
You know nothing at all. It's like, I can picture Caiaphas just sitting back. You always got that person on the phone that sits there and is just soaking it all in. Our CTO, Chief Technology Officer, he's a lot like that. He'll listen to everything. Then at the very end, he'll pipe up. And you think, man, this guy's just, I hope he never watches this. But first of all, he's kind of weak. He doesn't really know what he's doing. Then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that was insightful. Because he's earning that big paycheck, Like, where did you come up with that? So, Caiaphas is just listening to all this panic. And now we can call it panic. Because they're panicking about what to do. But Caiaphas stands up and says, listen, I've listened to your arguments, I've listened to your panic, and I got the idea. By the way, this was the idea that they did. This was the idea they followed through with. And from this time on, this is the idea they put into motion. And eventually it happened. In John 18, 19, 20. Caiaphas set the tone for the rest of the interaction with Jesus from this moment. And so he says, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people. Now we're going to talk about Jesus' death. See, it's Caiaphas that thought about this. It's Caiaphas that said, we need to put Jesus to death. You didn't think about that, did you? You talked about him just living out his days and everyone following him and everything. What if we kill him? Oh, by the way, let's get the Romans involved because we fear the crowds. If we just go out and kill him, we're going to have a big black eye because the crowds love him. So what do? We get Rome involved. oh, it's convenient that we want to follow Rome's rules when it's convenient for us, right?
Uh,
We have no king but Caesar.
mhm.
You don't? What about God? We have no law that says we can put someone to death. Pilate. You don't? What about the woman that you were going to kill? John chapter 8, the adulteress. And by the way, you have no law that, I'm looking in the Old Testament, that says you can't do that? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Sounds like you have a law to me. So, they make this thing up. They get Rome involved because they have to. They fear the crowds. So, what do we see? Caiaphas cooks up this idea that we're going to kill him. And it's exactly what they end up doing the rest of the book.
You think that there's further insight, or because it's not mentioned that he would be resurrected or that he believed in a resurrection, just that we should kill him. So I guess the mystery is, did he have an insight that he would be resurrected, or that's not mentioned?
You know what's interesting is that Caiaphas, and we'll read it here, see, he's high priest. You don't get to that in any time frame. You don't get to that position of high priest without God putting you there. We know that very clearly from Jesus and Aaron. And, right? God puts you in that position, just as he puts pastors and teachers and you know, whatever other officers there are in church members, in the very least. Church, everybody has a position because we are put there by God, period. So Rome, that's what, you know, 1 Corinthians teaches us. Well, as a high priest, Caiaphas didn't know what he was really saying. He's blinded by this anger, and he's trying to come up with a solution. And what does he say here? He says, verse 50, nor do you consider that it is expedient. It's expedient for who? Expedient for the Jews, not for Jesus. They want to stamp this thing out. They say, no, it's good for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish under Roman, you know, occupation, as it were. Now, what's funny is that what they feared actually happened in AD 70. Rome did come in, and Rome did destroy the temple, and ever since then, it hasn't been the same. There has been no temple. And they lost that. What they had, they lost it. Guess what? They still don't have it. It's 2,000 years later. But verse 51 kind of puts everything in perspective, and this is kind of what I wanted to bring out today, was that even though we, or man, or whoever, thinks that we can outsmart God sometimes, there is no outsmarting God. God had this plan in place from before the foundation of the world. And so, verse 51 says, now this he did not say on his own authority. He didn't just think this up. But being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. Now, do you think he meant to do that? Do you think that Caiaphas said, you know, I really know what's going on here? I don't think so. I think he genuinely had an idea to put Jesus to death. Oh, but it just happens to fit with God's plan. You know, it doesn't just happen to fit. It is God's plan. And Caiaphas, whether he knew it or not, was doing God's will. Just like Nebuchadnezzar. Whether he knew it or not, God was using him to come in and take, you know, and force Israel, force Judah to live out those 70 years. So you can, you know, we can say it's our idea. Or, you know, the world can say, oh, it's all us. But is it? Does God have his hand in these things? I think God has his hand in these things. And, oh, I invented this invention. I invented that invention. Yeah, you might have. But who's behind the scenes controlling these things? It's got to be God. It's got to be God. He's got a bigger plan, got a bigger purpose. And so Caiaphas unwittingly is prophesying that Jesus would die for the nation, and not only for that nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. Philip read that, hinted at that this morning in the Psalms, is that he looked forward to the time when we would believe, praying for us, right? Eventually that we would believe, that perpetually. That's us. And so, he says, verse 53, then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. That was the deciding factor. This moment when Caiaphas stood up and said, we need to get rid of him. We just need to find a way to do it. But it's expedient for us that he dies, one person for whole nation. Now, he was locked into Israel and just thinking about that, but he was also prophesying. Turn that into a spiritual application. Didn't one man die for the whole world? Didn't one man die for us? Wasn't it one man who took our place? And so for us to limit that as Caiaphas did is too narrow a view. Christ died for everybody. Christ died for us. And so back in chapter 18, they're finally putting into place Caiaphas' plan. And that's why I think John really brought this out. Verse 14 talks about Caiaphas. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Comma, this is God's plan. That's what he's really trying to say. This is what God had put into motion because God was the one that influenced him on that. And really, Caiaphas is just a part of that plan. Verse 15, and we're going to get more into what's actually going on, that night. It says, and Simon Peter followed Jesus. I thought they were supposed to scatter. Well, they did. Except for two. But were they really there, outspoken? No, I think that's what he meant when he says, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. The sheep in their hearts were scattered because they weren't out there saying, oh, take me with you. Lord, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to be numbered among you. Do you think John even did that? I think John kind of flew under the radar too. But Peter and John were the only two that I think even stuck around at all. I think the others just hightailed it out of there. So we see that Peter, after that night, after he cut the ear off, Jesus is being led away now. And I think that they came to get Jesus, and I think they honored Jesus' request to leave the others alone. I think they just weren't after those other ones, and they, who knows what would have happened to Peter had he said yes instead of no, I don't know him. Who knows what would have happened? But the point is that they were after Jesus. They honored his request. They're leading him back. Well, you have two curious souls, which, by the way, wasn't it Peter and John who ran to the tomb? And wasn't it James who was the early pastor? Not pastor, but wasn't he one of the pastors of the early church? Wasn't he the one that Herod captured, beheaded? And there in Acts, Peter, James, and John. Those three. Very, very influential leaders. And so there's Peter. He followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. John doesn't refer to himself ever by his name. Another disciple, or the one that Jesus loved. Do you remember when at the Last Supper, when Jesus said that it's one of you guys that's going to betray me? Peter was sitting across from Jesus, and John was sitting next to him. And John was just, they're all reclined. We don't do this in our society. But they were reclined, sitting down, eating. And John just lays his head back on Jesus' chest. And Peter just says, ask him who it is. Well, even then, it doesn't say John or me. As he's writing the book, he says the one whom Jesus loved. And so John doesn't write about himself in that respect. Then the other disciple, another disciple, so did another disciple. So here's Peter and John. Now that disciple, John, was known to the high priest. He had an inn and went in with Jesus to the courtyard of the high priest. And so here's John being allowed in. It's kind of like that bouncer, right? That lets people in that are VIPs, By the way, that's one job I could never do, is be a bouncer. Unless I had a taser. But they say that God made everybody. The Colt 45 made them equal. Isn't that what they say?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I would have to have some sort of taser. I could not be a bouncer. But for some reason, this girl, bouncer, when she opens the door, oh, I know John. Yep, come on in. You're known. Do a little shout out there as he walks in, right? But Peter didn't have that in. He didn't grow up with knowing the high priest like that. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, John, who was known to the high priest, went outside of the gate and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. So Peter didn't have that special privilege, did he? Why is that important? Peter can't slip by. Peter's got to face what Jesus told him what would happen to him. And how do I know that? Because it's this girl that confronts him first. It's this girl that's, you want to talk about 3 denies? This is number 1. See, John didn't have to put up with that. Maybe because John wasn't out there putting his neck on the line, I don't know. But John didn't say, I'll never do this. John just kind of stayed back and said, okay, Jesus, if that's what you say, then I'll go along with it. And you say that you're going to be, all these things are going to happen, and I'm not going to stop you. Peter said, no, that'll never happen. But at some point, because Jesus said it would happen, he's got to eat these words. It has to happen. It's been prophesied.
Andrew, I'm getting the sense here, also, this is a very high-powered meeting. These guys, now that they've made this decision, it's all business. And so it's a closed-door session. It's behind-the-door session.
Yep.
They got a girl watching the door.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pretty potent now. I mean, this is getting serious. Not anyone can be in. This isn't a
Right.
big thing.
No, they're fast-tracking him.
Yeah, they're fast-tracking.
They're fast-tracking him. And John doesn't include a lot of what happened where they blindfolded him and said prophesy and stuff like that. They don't include a lot of the dialogue. John doesn't include a lot of the dialogue that happens in the Jewish fast-tracking. John includes a little bit more of what the Roman aspect of it was. But there was a lot that was going on that night. Keep in mind that it's still night. Not for long, though. And so Peter stood outside the door, and the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her and said, yeah, I vouch for him. He can come in. He knew Peter was out there. He knew he couldn't get in unless John vouched for him. So John said he needs to come in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? And there's strike 1 right here. He says, I am not. Do you think John heard that, him say that? I think he did. I think he was standing right there. Well, that's powerful right there, okay? That hits you like a ton of bricks when you realize that Peter, James, and John were witnessing to a lot of stuff. And there's Peter denying that he was a disciple in front of John.
Well, and I think the key word there is also. So she's saying that John was a disciple as well, and there was no repercussion there, no denial there.
Right.
She knew John was, and yet she's letting him in.
Yeah.
Why did she only ask Peter?
I don't know.
Aren't you also one of his disciples?
Yeah.
As if kind of relating those two. And so I think the only reason the question was asked is so Peter could
Right.
deny it.
Yeah.
Because that had to come true.
Yeah.
And 3 has to start with 1, so here's number 1.
Yeah.
And Peter's walking in like, hey, great, John, this is great, we have access, all of a sudden,
Right.
boom, now this question comes out. But she knew that they were together.
No.
She knew that they were both disciples.
If she knew John, she knew that he was a follower. Yeah.
So this is like a worthless denial. There's no life at stake. You could have easily said, yeah, I am.
Yeah.
And what would it have cost him? He's already in. So again, I think it kind of certainly shows the panic of the night, right? I mean, that night there was panic, there was chaos. But I think Peter wasn't quite in his right mind because he was still trying to process what was happening. And so for him to say that, to kind of have a throwaway denial like that when there was nothing, this girl wasn't gonna do anything to
Like
him.
you said, he's not in his right mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this girl wasn't gonna do anything to him, she didn't have a sword, she wasn't gonna hurt him. And there wasn't a mob or anything like that, they're just trying to gain access, they're closer to Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just seems like, it seems like this was one that was like, are you really? Are you kidding? Like, why say that when
Yeah.
she's already putting you and John together? She knows who John is. Why would you, like, that one doesn't, of the 3, this one doesn't make,
Right.
I mean, if, none of them make sense, but
Yeah.
this one especially doesn't make sense. But the only reason I think why this was asked is so he could say he didn't know.
Right. And I think, this is just letting your mind wander, but, and I don't know if this has any correlation, but this is not, you take the certain ingredients and you just extract it out, and you have people of interest behind a, what do you call it, gate, okay? Then you have a gate, and then you have a girl watching the gate. How often do we see that scenario played out in the Bible? Okay? Twice. And who's involved knocking at the gate both times? Peter. It's interesting, isn't it? And I don't know if this has anything to do with anything, but in Acts, we see that Peter was shackled in prison, and we see that the Jerusalem church was gathered, parts of it anyway, were gathered together in a house, and they were praying on their knees, I believe, begging God to let him go. And an angel lets Peter go, leads him out, and Peter now goes to that house. He's knocking at the gate, and a girl comes to let him to report. Well, she's so excited that it's Peter that she runs in and doesn't even open the gate. And she runs in and tells, like, hey, Peter's out there. Oh, he must have died. This is his ghost. Isn't that what they said? As he's still knocking, it's dark. I'm a fugitive. Let me in. So they run out and go get him, and then he comes in. But just those ingredients, you just, I don't know. Maybe that's something, maybe it's not. I just thought I'd throw that out there. So, okay. On our story here, we have, as Phil brought out, I mean, and I never looked at it like that, but really it's, what do you got to lose? I didn't really look at the also part, but it makes sense. If John was able to get in, they knew John, well, what are you going to gain? What are you going to lose?
Especially if John was the one Jesus loved, they were always together,
Yeah.
right? I
They
mean,
were.
I don't think John was out of Jesus' sight very much at all, if ever.
No.
There was
I don't
always
think
that
Peter was.
correlation, huh?
I don't think Peter
I don't think
was.
Peter was either, you're right. But yet, again, the question's only asked of Peter.
So she asks him, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I'm not. Now the servants and officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Remember, it's dark. That's probably why it's colder. But the officers, do you think they'd be there normally? No. They're standing guard so that the disciples or whoever else don't try to break Jesus out, or they're still standing guard because it's a late night. This is not a normal night. They finally got the one that they wanted. And so they're outside standing guard still, but while they're standing guard, it's cold. So you make a fire. And Peter, I think, just kind of, it's dark. They can't really see who he is. You think he's just kind of hidden. I think he just kind of comes up right next to him and just starts warming his hands too. Not wanting the spotlight. He doesn't want to be known. He just wants to see what's going to happen to Jesus as incognito as he possibly can. I think John didn't really want to be out there too. He was out there enough, but I think John and Peter both had to hide a little bit. And so now the story flips back to Jesus. It says the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Well, that's something that's a loaded question there. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always met, and in secret I have said nothing. He's saying, my ministry wasn't in secret. And anything I wanted you to know, anything I came to say, the kingdom's coming and repent and all those things, that was out in the open. I didn't have a private ministry just with these people and then a private ministry. I spoke in the synagogue. I spoke in the temple. I spoke on the mountaintop. And he spoke to the crowds, the multitudes. So for him to ask him about those, things is kind of ludicrous. But like I said, they're trying to fast track him. That's what you want to talk about swift justice.
Yeah.
Look at some of the regimes over the last couple hundred years. Those guys have swift justice. Okay, there was some Sophie Scholl. You probably don't. I mean, I had learned about it today, but basically, she was a part of the underground in Germany, and she was a college student. Her and her brothers, college students, and they tried to take the college and other college and print off these leaflets, saying that we need to overthrow what little bit we can do to get rid of these crazy Nazis, our government. And so they would literally go to colleges and they would take leaflets and just throw them out from the main hall down all the steps, and people would gather, and it was anti-government stuff, trying to get it. Well, they finally found the culprit. They would have to meet underground, as it were, with printing presses and just a couple of different people, and they would be printing these things out. And they were trying to spread that. And eventually they were caught. And their trial was like an hour later they were beheaded. I mean, it did not take long back then for you to be caught. And when you really want someone gone, They're gone. And this is what they wanted to do to Jesus. They wanted to fast track his trial, a trial. It's not really a trial. Well, they call that a kangaroo court.
Yeah.
So he says, he's asking about his disciples and Doug. Let's just get this on the books that we asked him about this stuff. Jesus said, what are you talking about? Everybody knows what I was preaching. Everybody in all of Israel. They went from the top of Israel to the bottom of Israel, all in the middle, and said, you guys know what I was doing. You don't need to ask me that. He says, and in secret I've said nothing. Why do you ask me? He says, ask those who've heard me. What I said to them, indeed, they know what I said. You don't need to ask me, ask the multitudes. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by slapped with his palm Jesus, saying, with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Talk about a kangaroo court. He's giving a defense. Why would he be punished immediately? Jesus asked the question. Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. I thought this was a court. I thought I had rights by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Isn't that their own law? Mm-hmm. He says, but if I do speak something that's truth, why did you hit me? It's very clear they don't want to hear his side of anything. I think that might have had something to do with him being quiet. What we don't see here is that all the witnesses they had to bring in for this monkey trial to finally get something. And we're going to see if we have time. Oh, let's see. We don't have time. We're going to see next week that Pilate asks them a very simple question. What did he do? We want him dead. Never got your answer, so Pilate, here, you go find out what he did. Ball's in your court now. Pilate comes back and said, yeah, I talked to him. He didn't do anything. Doesn't matter. Oh, we're going to rely on the little clause that you can, that one person dies at your Passover feast, at the celebration of that. Yeah, we want him to be that. Not Barabbas, the robber? No, we want Jesus to die. Talk about fast-tracking him. Talk about breaking the rules, your own rules. So let's just wrap up about Peter so we can move on to the court scene next week. It says, verse 24, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So that was the the father-in-law, of Caiaphas was Annas. And so now they got him there. Now they're going to ship him off to Caiaphas. Then finally they're going to send him to Pilate. It says, now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, when they finally recognized him, I think, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I'm not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of whose ear Peter had cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. And John doesn't include it here, but we all know what Peter did. When it finally hit him like a ton of bricks, he went out and he wept. Wept is not the same as crying. Weeping is not the same as crying. How many times have we wept in our lives? I could probably count on one hand. It's not the same. Peter knew what he did. He came to grips with it as soon as that rooster crowed, and all the words came back to him. And he went out and was extremely sorry that he did it. I think he was sorry to the point where he was discouraged from ever serving God again. But that's why John 21's there, isn't it?
Yeah.
But we're going to see that. Anybody have anything else?
This last scene, and this might kind of seem kind of rudimentary, but it has a very movie feel to it.
Oh, absolutely. It goes from one scene to the
Yeah,
next.
because you have the ending scene of Peter warming himself. Boom. Now the next scene is Jesus. Well, then it's when we last left
Yeah.
Peter.
Yep.
He was it has this, which is why you can see this was made. I mean, this was obviously predates movies, but there's so many sub levels to this night. There's the subplot about Peter and what's happening, and then where was John? John's not mentioned again until the very end. And so what was John, what access did he have, what did he see, what did he hear? And then you've got the priest and the high priest sort of figuring him out, and you've got Jesus. Well, then you've got this subplot with Peter. Meanwhile, you've got Rome hanging out there, who's over all of this stuff. And so then you have the apostles. Where did they go? You know, they're just gone. And so you've got all these subplots that night. And then we see, you know, as you said, John doesn't mention it, but then we see scene 1 and scene 2 interact. And so here it says that the one scene ends with, you know, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Well, at the same time, Jesus must have gone right next to where Peter was. He's being led from one to the other. And there's Peter warming himself. So Jesus walked right by that fire. So now you've got these two scenes happening apart, now interacting with each other. And so it's just, there's so many levels to this night, which is why I'm thankful that John gives us so much detail about it. Because this was the culmination of why Jesus came. This is the whole reason for it. And so to give us as much detail as he does, and then you throw in the other three, and we have some other clues and hints and things. But this night was the end all for his entire ministry. Not his birth, not when he was 12 in the temple, not the beginning. It was this night and what would happen, because this was the earmarked moment for what would happen. This was prophesied thousands of years prior, would be talked about for thousands of years after. You know, even in glory, there he is. And even afterwards, he still has these scars. You know, and who's to say he won't? You know, when he finally returns, just as a reminder of when he. I mean, there's just so many different levels to this night that it's fascinating.
Yeah,
it's
it
just
is.
so many different subplots going on.
John spent a lot of time talking about it too. And one last thing, that I think their trial only lasted as long as it took for it not to be so rude to wake up Pilate. Because it said in the early morning, they went over to the Praetorium, the governor's mansion, if you will, where he was living, early morning. I think it only lasted that just as long as it had to. And then they wanted to get rid of him. So, all right, let's go to dismiss.